Today in world literature, we turn to the study of the work of Maxine Hong Kingston. The child of Chinese immigrants, Kingston's 1976 Woman Warrior, the book which made her famous, blends autobiography and fiction to capture the memories of a Chinese-American girlhood and to combine these accounts of Chinese history and culture. In this lecture, Dr. Diane Simmons tells us that Kingston created a new myth in her work. Dr. Simmons herself, a novelist, is the author of Dreams Like Thunder, and as such, we can hear in Dr. Simmons her response as a novelist to another novelist. Dr. Simmons tells us that for Kingston, the myth that she inherited, they were not adequate. Women were portrayed as passive and weak. Kingston wanted to create new stories, ones that would counteract the notion that women were useless, a burden to a family. Her woman warrior fights for her family, yet retains her humanity. Her characters often laugh a nimble laugh, with lives so full that they sprinkle red and gold on the creatures all around them. Her characters face down brutality with true heroism.
Maxine Hong Kingston is an American writer born in California of immigrant Chinese parents right before World War II. She grew up poor, working in her family's laundry in Stockton. She was born into a world in which racist and sexist stereotyping was common. In her Chinese family, she writes, boys were valued more highly than girls. Girls who would eventually marry and leave the family were seen as a waste of time and money. Girls are maggots in the rice is one of the expressions Kingston grew up hearing. Out on the street, she was reviled for being Chinese and remembers being spit upon and run down by kids on bikes yelling, "Chinaman." In the early 1960s, Kingston went to the University of California at Berkeley, where she enthusiastically joined student protests against the war in Vietnam, and where she supported the civil rights movement to give equal rights to black Americans. And Kingston came to feel in the 60s, when so many around her were protesting injustice, that it is the power of imagination that will create a more just world. And she sets out in her writing to make that change happen. And so I think we can see in Kingston, in her own early struggles against injustice, as well as the beliefs formed during the anti-war civil rights years of the 60s, that these are the things that have determined the course of her work as a writer. Kingston, who became an overnight celebrity with her first book, the memoir Woman Warrior, a memoir of a girlhood among ghosts, has one central drive throughout her work, and that drive is to create a new mythology. She wants to create new myths for herself personally, for Chinese Americans, and for America itself. What is a myth? You can find a definition in the back of your book. We can say that a myth is a story people tell to explain things, to give themselves a common identity, a way of knowing their identity, and of passing these understandings throughout the culture. So why does Kingston feel the need to create new myths? There were plenty of Chinese myths, and the Americans too have their stories that help them understand and explain themselves. But Kingston, like many people writing around the world today, felt that the myths, the stories, the explanations she grew up with were not really hers, and did not explain the world in a way in which she could accept. Rather, Kingston felt that the stories she grew up hearing had been created by those who were trying to explain the world and perhaps justify their own positions of power by showing the inferiority of others. Male stories portrayed women as inferior. American stories did the same for the Chinese. Like many others writing around the world today, she felt trapped in those stories. How could she see herself as strong and valuable if all of the stories her culture told her were that she was weak and useless? How could she break out of the stereotypes that both Chinese and American mythology had created for her? Kingston then sets out to tell new stories, to create new myths that explain the world in different ways. To do this, Kingston partakes freely of a mixture of materials: traditional Chinese stories that she changes as she likes, American stories, her own memory, and her family stories. And when she needs to, she makes things up, dropping easily into the realm of magic. Even the title of her first work, The Woman Warrior, shows what she's up to. In the mix of memoir and fiction, Kingston writes to counter the stereotype of women as useless, a burden upon the family. Rather, she creates, altering a Chinese story, the image of a woman warrior, Fa Mulan, who goes to war in ancient China to protect and avenge her family against tyrannical power. At the same time, this heroine does not give up being a woman and a family person. She falls in love, marries, and gives birth to a son, who, as he grows older, is delighted to have a mother who wears shiny armor. Thus, Kingston seeks to counter the stereotype that women are weak and useless. She also insists on creating figures, and this will be true of both her female and male characters, who have retained their humanity despite the intimidation or harsh treatment they have suffered. Like Fa Mulan, the woman warrior, they will fight for their rights without being brutalized or dehumanized. Rather, her protagonists, like the character of Kingston's mother, Brave Orchid, face down intimidation and brutality with cheerful heroism. Quote, "The hero in a ghost story," Kingston writes in Woman Warrior, "laughs a nimble laugh. His life so full it splatters red and gold on the creatures all around him." In Woman Warrior, Kingston tries to break down a stereotype of women created by Chinese culture. In the book China Men, from which our reading is taken, Kingston tries to break down the stereotype of Chinese men created by American culture. It is a stereotype created in the 19th century as Chinese men came to America in large numbers. At first, the Chinese labor was welcomed in the mines of the West and on the Transcontinental Railroad as America pushed across the continent. Once these great projects were completed, however, and more Americans found their way west to help with the work, the Chinese were no longer welcome and were driven out or forced into jobs no frontiersman wanted to do, predictably the women's work of cooking and laundry. Increasingly, the Chinese men were relegated to ghettos in Chinatowns where they ran restaurants and laundries. These were bachelor communities where gambling and prostitution were common. These Chinatowns seemed unnatural, even evil to American eyes, even though it was American law that prohibited the men from having normal family lives. The men were prohibited by law from bringing in Chinese wives or marrying non-Chinese women. What then is the stereotype of the Chinese immigrant man that grows out of this time, which Kingston must knock down? What stories have Americans told to explain the Chinese and their own treatment of the Chinese? Probably most of us have internalized a stereotype. The Chinese men have been relegated to menial tasks and are thus seen as weak and passive, unfit for more robust, traditional male activities. Forced to accept minimal living standards, they are seen as despicable. How could people live like that, all crowded together? How could they work for so little pay? Forced to live without wives and children, they are seen as not fully men. Deprived of love and family, they are seen as people without truly human, emotional lives. And so this is the stereotype that Kingston must try to break down in China Men. In the section we have read, she does this by reimagining one Chinese worker, her own immigrant grandfather, Gong. Are we to take this portrait as literally true? No, I don't think so. Rather, I think we are to understand that Kingston is trying to reimagine her grandfather, not as the stereotypical Chinese laborer, passive, lacking in emotional life, but as profoundly human, with all the desires and dreams, fears and griefs that human life entails. Let's look then at this excerpt from China Men to see how Kingston reimagines one Chinese man, her grandfather, Gong. First, let's look at the opening paragraph. Here we see Gong arriving in the American West to work on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Look first at the depiction of trees. Why do you think does she spend so much time describing the tree that he is asked to fell? And how is the tree seen from Gong's point of view? We note first that the tree is seen as an animal, screeching in pain, fighting to save itself. And then it becomes human, full of pain and grief, wounded, blinded, crying, and finally defeated. Quote, "At last it stopped fighting." In the next paragraph, we see the tree rising up out of the ground as if through its own power, and we see again that it is hurt, its human-like veins and muscles tearing. Then, in defeat, it is an animal. Its upturned white roots look like claws. Why does Kingston portray the tree in this way? What does she achieve by making it human, giving it human-like pain? Well, we can't know for sure what Kingston intends. Sometimes an author doesn't know for sure herself. But what can we say about this portrait? First, the pain, the human suffering that Gong imagines for the tree points, I think, to the humanity of Gong himself. He knows what suffering is. But is Kingston using the tree even more pointedly? Are we to see that the tree represents Gong, that he too has been torn painfully from his own home to be used in this massive push to build America? Does he understand the tree's suffering and its struggle to survive because he's locked in a similar struggle himself? Does Kingston use the portrait of the tree to begin shading in the portrait of Gong? Look now at the passage where Ah Gong sees the stars. First note Ah Gong's response to his surroundings. Though the previous passage suggests pain and suffering of being torn from his roots, we have also heard Ah Gong say of his plight, quote, "I could take it." With this passage, perhaps, we see how he manages to take it, to stick it out. For here we see he is alive to the beauty and the wonder of his surroundings in the high Sierra Nevada mountains. Though he has never seen ice or snow before, he is able to see beauty in them, to see them as diamonds and silver. And in this strange new world, he also manages to see order, even a familiar order, as he looks at the stars, recognizing the same constellations in the sky that he has seen at home in China. This is comforting. He is still in the same world, however strange it may seem. And now he watches two stars, around which the Chinese have woven a romance, that of lovers who are separated all but one night of the year. On this one night, they come together when the stars, representing the figures of spinning girl and cowboy, meet. And we see that discovering these two stars and watching their progress in the sky not only gives Ah Gong something familiar in this new land, this wilderness, but also, Kingston says, something to look forward to. On the day of the meeting, Ah Gong celebrates, even though he's far from the family life where such celebrations usually take place. What is Kingston doing with all of this? Think of all the other ways she could have imagined her grandfather in the mining camp. Why has she chosen to focus on a man who is comforted by the sight of certain stars in the sky? How, again, does she work to break down the stereotype of the immigrant Chinese man? Well, here's a man who has found himself in a wilderness, who, it is implied, has been ripped painfully, perhaps even fatally, from all that sustains him. Still, we see him looking up, looking for beauty and wonder, finding something familiar. We see him sustaining himself with the story of lovers who continue faithful despite separation, and who can look forward to rare but joyous reunions. Surely in this way we see him struggling to hold on to his own identity and his own humanity through his appreciation of beauty and his ability to find the familiar. And surely he is thinking of his own hopes to be reunited with those he loves, as he rejoices over the long-awaited meeting between cowboy and spinning girl. This, then, is not the stereotypical dehumanized coolie, but a man who struggles and succeeds in holding on to his humanity, his dreams and desires. He is so mesmerized by his dreams of the joyful meeting of lovers that he falls asleep under the stars and is only awakened by the rain. Look next at the portrait Kingston paints of the basket man. Ah Gong and other workers are lowered in baskets down the side of the mountain to plant explosives, blowing up the mountain so the railway can be built. And what does Kingston want us to take away from this passage? Well, we see Ah Gong, quote, suspended in the quiet sky where, quote, he has all kinds of crazy thoughts, even thoughts of suicide. Here again, as with her portrayal of the tree, Kingston wants to show the dislocation and loss this man must have felt. Ripped like the tree from the earth that sustained him, he is now floating in thin air, cut off from all that makes him who and what he is. And there in the sky, he considers just bailing out and ending all of his troubles. The high emptiness of the sky can be read then as the alien and empty new world. But there's another element. Not only must Ah Gong float in the sky, but he must also set and light the dynamite and then escape the explosion. The job is extremely dangerous. Some men are unlucky and are blown out of the sky. And what is Kingston doing with this? If the sky is the empty new world, is the dynamite Ah Gong's feeling of loss and separation? If he can endure these feelings, he might be able to build a new life. But if they become too intense, he might explode, go crazy, kill himself. In paragraph 10, Kingston stops to dwell on the men who are blown up. One goes silently, the other screams and struggles, but both are broken on the rocks below. Ah Gong, realizing that he too could be blown out of life by the literal dynamite of the railroad or by the figurative dynamite of his loss and loneliness, checks his gear and then does what he has to do. Heroically, he, quote, enters the sky again. Yes, Kingston says that fear, the loss, dread is there. But what else? These men, like ants, are, quote, changing the face of the world. They are, quote, reshaping the mountain. As Kingston seeks to break down the stereotype that the Chinese men are less than fully human, lacking rich emotional lives, she also attacks the idea that they are nothing but work machines to be used and discarded. Rather, she shows that by spending their energy, their sweat, their piss, and their semen in the new land, they have become part of it, and it has become part of them. In paragraph 14, Agong, high in the sky, quote, pissed overboard, and sees that, quote, he has sent a part of himself hurtling. Again, the picture is mixed. In having him send a part of himself out into the empty, dangerous sky, out into the dangerous new world, Kingston still suggests the idea of loss. But when Agong, overcome with the beauty and still the fear of this new world, ejaculates out into space, the image shifts. Still there is the idea of loss. But if loss is a continuing theme, here too is the idea of connection and procreation. For now the sky is a vagina, and Agong, for all his loss and fear, can also be seen as spending himself in the creation of something new, something that is and will forever be a part of him. He is building America, I think Kingston is saying. He's not an alien work machine to be used and discarded. Rather, he is one of America's founding fathers.
Maxine Hong Kingston writes of a world people with alien Caucasians and the mystifying Asian ancestors brought to her through stories her mother told her. You must not tell anyone, she writes in a selection called No Name Woman, what I am about to tell you. In China, your father had a sister who killed herself. She jumped into the family well. We say that your father has all brothers because it is as if she had never been born. In the story that follows, Kingston imagines the world in which that woman lived and the culture that led to her alienation and to her death. Through such stories, as one critic has written, Kingston takes one far from the domestic grievances of American suburbia into the wit and the love and the grief of another place entirely. And her ability to transport the reader and to make the reader consider how people are alike in their pain and their suffering. Kingston takes her place with Toni Morrison as an American writer who lives in a nation that is people with ghosts of a cultural past and that informs and shapes the present.